As we look deeper into the brain below the cortex, there are a number of important structures for speech, language, and hearing. Broadly, we can divide these into two physical regions: the subcortex, just beneath the cortex, and the hindbrain, deeper within the brain and closer to the spinal cord. We'll talk in a little bit of detail about a few structures in each of these areas. One subcortex structure, the basal ganglia, is a little bit hard to imagine inside the brain in 3 dimensions. It's shaped kind of like a shrimp with a fatter head and then kind of a long curly tail. The basal ganglia has important functions for the control and coordination of movement and initiation of movement in the body. It's got both strong connections to the motor cortex as well as to the somatosensory cortex, because how we do movements depends not just on the movement we want to do, but what the current state of our body is. Substructures inside the basal ganglia include the caudate nucleus, which is the tail part of the basal ganglia, and the putamen and globus pallidus, which are more the head part of the basal ganglia. On this slide, there's a slightly different view of the basal ganglia. On the left, we have a coronal section of the brain. So here the front part of the brain is separated from the back part. And so you see more of a cut through the cortex than we've had in some of our other views of the brain. So the darker tan areas are gray matter. The lighter tan areas are white matter. Deeper within the cortex, the basal ganglia structures can be seen slightly off-center from the brainstem and some of the other central structures in between the cortex and the spinal cord along that white matter pathway. On the right side of this image, we have some of the connections between the basal ganglia and other parts of the brain. You don't really need to know the details of all of these connections at this time, but I wanted to include this image to give you kind of a big picture feeling for how much interconnection there is between these various structures. So on the cortex itself, we have our motor cortex and supplementary motor areas in the frontal cortex, and the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Those have connections down into the substructures of the basal ganglia, like the putamen, the globus pallidus. There are also connections from the basal ganglia feeding back through the thalamus, which we'll talk about in a minute, and back up into the cortex, and that's how you have feedback information from the body influencing motor movements and plans for motor movements. The second subcortex structure we'll cover is the hippocampus. The hippocampus has a lot of important functions in memory. It has connections to the thalamus, where sensory information comes in, and the temporal lobe, which is our sensory reception point for hearing. This image showing the hippocampus in the brain again gives us a somewhat of an idea of where this structure is located. There's parts of it on the left and right sides of the brain, somewhat off-center. You can also see a number of connections between the hippocampus and other structures. So for example, connections to the olfactory bulb, and you may have heard or read about how our sense of smell is more strongly connected to memory in our brain. This connection between the olfactory bulb and the hippocampus is part of why people talk about that. The thalamus is also shown on this image. The fornix is closely connected. The fornix has functions for memory, and more specifically in voluntary recall memory. So not just looking at something and recognizing it as familiar, but being able to say, remember a word you heard earlier, or remember a face that you've seen before. Be able to call it to mind. There's also connections to the amygdala, which is an important emotional regulation structure. So the connection of our memory functions to these various sensory, emotional, and cognitive processes is, again, fairly complicated, not something you have to worry about the specific details of, but I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of these intermediate subcortex structures and their connections to both higher and lower level functions in the brain. Finally, in the subcortex, we have the thalamus. The thalamus sits just on top of the brainstem. We have its location as in the previous image, in the upper left image, and then detailed structure inside the thalamus in the lower right image. We aren't going to go into all of that detailed structure, but the idea is, given the thalamus's location, it acts as a kind of a relay station for sensory information that's coming into the brain, going out to the body, and again interconnecting to a lot of other of these functions. Sensory information from everything but the sense of smell will pass through the thalamus in some way. So that covers your vision and your hearing, as well as your body senses, like touch and pain and whatnot coming from the body, as well as things like proprioception, your sense of what your body position currently is. Deeper than the subcortex structures, we have the hindbrain structures. One of these structures is the cerebellum, sometimes called the primitive brain or the lizard brain part of a person. It has a structure that's fairly similar to the cortex. Most of the cerebellar functions are focused on things related to body movement. So all of the intentional body movements that we make, we may have a general idea of what the movement should be in the brain, like to pick something up, but then the details of how exactly we might pick something up, like a pen on the desk, depends on where that is, relative to your hand, whether you're sitting or standing, whether you have to control your balance and lean over and grab it, etc. If you were, say, working on a car, laying underneath it, the way you would reach and grab things would be really different from how you were sitting up, because gravity works against you differently in that situation. The cerebellar functions involve taking into account a lot of these extra aspects that are going to affect your movement. The cerebellum, like the brain, can be broken up into some sub-pieces. It does have left and right hemispheres, as well as 3 lobes, one known as the anterior, but it's really in the superior position when you look at most of our images. The middle, which is more in an inferior position, and then a very small lobe, the flocculonodular lobe, which is fairly difficult to say. That's that little band at the very anterior part of the cerebellum. Like the cortex, nerve cells in the cerebellum are in layers, but in this case 3 layers rather than the 6 that we have in the cortex. So again, it's not quite as sophisticated of a structure, but it has basically a similar structure to the cortex. As we get into more detail about cerebellar function, one way to help understand that is to look a little bit at how the cerebellum connects to other structures. So in this image, we have connections from the cerebellum to brainstem structures like the pons that we'll talk about in a little bit. The thalamus that I just mentioned before, that's our sensory relay station. And then from there heading out to the rest of the structures in the cortex. Studies of cerebellar function have found that the anterior cortex inside the cerebellum is primarily involved in controlling posture as you move and balance relative to gravity. The middle lobe of the cerebellum is involved in a lot of fine motor movement, so doing fine work with your hands, for example, or speech articulation, which involves a lot of fine motor movements. And the flocculonodular lobe is involved in adjusting movement for your position in space, via information you get from the vestibular system. So whether you're standing up or laying down, leaning forward, etc. Some new research on cerebellar function has argued that it is also connected to higher cognitive functions, more abstract thinking type functions, and to emotional reactions for the purposes of us studying speech and language. Our main interest is in motor activities and control of speech articulation. Last but not least, the deepest of our brain structures, the brainstem, connects all of those higher brain structures in the cortex, the subcortex, and the cerebellum to the spinal column, where nerves go out to the body to make motor movements happen, to receive sensory information. There are also reflex and control areas in the brainstem itself that are related to basic life functions like keeping your heart beating, monitoring oxygen levels in the blood for respiration, things like that. Probably our primary interest in the brainstem comes from two different things. One is that connection to the spinal cord, so sensory information coming in from the body comes through the brainstem. Motor commands going out to the body go out through the brainstem, and also the cranial nerves, many of which are important to speech and language, arise from the brainstem. The brainstem itself has three different subparts. From superior to inferior, we have the midbrain, which is kind of halfway between the higher brain structures like the thalamus and the lower brain structures, which are more like the spinal cord. There are connections from the midbrain to the cerebellum, to the cerebrum, to the basal ganglia. Auditory and visual information from the eyes and ears comes through the midbrain to be processed, in addition to coming through other areas like the thalamus and ending up in the cortex. The middle structure in the brainstem is the pons. When you look at the brainstem in various images, the pons is usually identifiable because it is somewhat wider, fatter, more bulbous than the other parts of the brainstem. The pons is the primary connection point between the brainstem and the cerebellum, and also a certain amount of hearing gets processed in the pons, and then of course all the information from the body that's coming up from the spinal cord is going to pass through the pons. The medulla is the lowest part of the brainstem, and it is fairly similar to the spinal cord itself. It mostly has transmission pathways, but there are a few reflex areas in the medulla for some of your basic survival functions. One of the important structural aspects of the medulla is the pyramidal decussation. This is the place where nerves switch over for contralateral organization. So things out on the right side of the body, those nerves are on the right side of the body until they get to the medulla, and then they switch over to the left side and propagate from there up the left side to eventually end up in the left hemisphere. Vice versa for things on the left side of the body, eventually ending up in the right hemisphere. The cranial nerves all emerge from the brainstem. That will be the subject of a completely separate lecture, but this gives you a visual image of the origin points of the cranial nerves. Generally speaking, the lower numbered cranial nerves are near the top of the brainstem, and the highest numbered cranial nerves are near the bottom of the brainstem. There are 12 cranial nerves in total that we will study in detail in a separate lecture.